Hi everyone, welcome to part one of sectionalism. This is the story of how the North and the South begin to pull apart and lead us into the Civil War. Our questions to think about here: what were the precedents set by the Northwest Ordinance? How was the issue of slavery solved in the Louisiana Purchase? How was the issue of slavery solved in Oregon and Texas? And how did the Compromise of 1850 settle the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession? We're going to begin by taking a step back to 1787. Keep in mind that we're still operating under the Articles of Confederation in this moment, and we're dealing with an issue of new land. Remember that with the end of the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris, the United States gained all of the land east of the Mississippi River except for Florida. And so we're going to zoom in on what was called the Northwest Territory because it's north and west of Virginia. One of the things that's going to really be important when we talk about setting precedents with the Northwest Ordinance is that the United States government is going to make the decision that any new territory is going to be incorporated on equal standing with the existing states. So what that means is we're going to provide a path to statehood that's going to allow these new territories to be fully integrated and on equal standing with the original 13 states. So as you can see on this slide, we've organized the Northwest Territory with the opportunity of creating 3 to 5 territories. The government would be appointed by Congress until enough settlers moved into this area to provide a path for statehood. Once 60,000 settlers moved into this area, a state could submit a constitution to Congress. Once Congress approves that, then that area, that territory, now becomes a state. But the other precedent that I want to mention here about the Northwest Ordinance is that there's going to be this growing issue about whether or not slavery is going to be allowed in the new territories of the United States. And Congress makes it very clear in the Northwest Ordinance that slavery is not going to be allowed in this territory. But that debate is going to come up again and again as the United States expands geographically. So in 1803, the United States purchased Louisiana Territory from France, and it adds this huge segment of Western territory to the United States. And as we begin to have settlers move into this area, and as the population grows, the debate over slavery is going to rise up once again. But there's another thing going on in the background here, and it has to do with the power struggle in Congress between the growing abolitionist movement in the North and the strengthening pro-slavery movement in the South. Now, we talked before about the 3/5 Compromise, which had given the Southern states a greater voice in the House of Representatives than their white voting population would suggest. But because of the market revolution, the population of the North is growing faster than the population of the South, which means the anti-slavery voices from the North are outweighing the pro-slavery voices of the Southern states in the House of Representatives. So that means that the power struggle is shifting to the Senate, where each state has 2 senators. So now we're going to start to be talking about how the free states, those that don't allow slavery, are trying to balance out the pro-slavery voices from the Southern states. So Louisiana comes in 1812, and it's clear from Louisiana's history that they're going to come in as a slave state, a state where slavery is allowed. But A few years later, Missouri applies for statehood in 1817. And what complicates the issue is that when Missouri submits their proposed state constitution, it doesn't say anything about banning slavery. And there's about 3,000 slaves living in Missouri at this time. So this bill, this statehood bill, gets hung up in Congress for a couple of years because at the moment that Missouri applied for statehood, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. So there was a balance in the Senate. And Missouri, if they were able to come in as a slave state, they would upset that balance. So poor Missouri is waiting around for a couple of years for Congress to debate their statehood petition. In 1819, James Talmadge of New York is going to propose an amendment to Missouri's statehood bill. And what he proposed is that it would call for a gradual emancipation of Missouri's slaves, and it would come to the point where Missouri would end up being a free state. Now, what's interesting about the Talmadge resolution is that it was passed by the House of Representatives, where Northerners have the advantage, but it's shot down in the Senate, where the power struggle is more equitable. The following year, Henry Clay is going to propose a compromise, and we know this as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This is going to allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, and Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, would become its own state, a free state. So Maine would balance out Missouri as a free state and a slave state coming in as a pair. Finally, the Missouri Compromise would draw a line through the rest of the Louisiana Purchase where any new states coming in north of that line would automatically be free states. Any states coming in south of that line would be slave states. So take a look at this map and you see that Missouri Compromise line at the southern border of Missouri. So in a way, the Missouri Compromise, whereby Missouri comes in as a slave state and Maine comes in as a free state, sort of sets up this compromise of having one free state come in and one slave state come in. And this is where we've sort of paired Oregon and Texas together. The story of the Northeast is interesting because it had been claimed previously by the Spanish, as part of New Spain. It had been claimed by the Russians as part of Alaska. It had been claimed by the British as part of Canada. And the United States was trying to make a claim for this area as part of the Louisiana Purchase, although that's kind of a stretch. In 1818, the Spanish have essentially relinquished their claim, as have the Russians, but the British and the United States have agreed to sort of a joint occupation. And this really isn't a big deal in 1818, simply because there are very few Anglos in this area. Essentially, you have mostly Native Americans with a few mountain men moving in as part of the fur trade here. In the 1840s, however, things are going to change dramatically as word began to spread about Oregon's lush landscape and farming potential. Plus, with the economic crisis set off by the fall of the Bank of the United States, many people are looking for new opportunities. And so we see this massive increase in the number of American settlers in this area. Now, briefly, it looks like the Americans are going to push for a more northern border of Oregon country, although in 1846, they finally come to an agreement with the British that would set the border between British territory in Canada and American territory at the 49th parallel where it is today. When Oregon becomes a territory in 1848, they made the effort to avoid the conflict over slavery by completely banning slavery and not allowing free Black persons to come into this area at all. And in 1859, Oregon formally becomes a state. Many of you are already aware of the story of how Texas becomes part of the United States. So I'm going to keep this pretty short. The area of Texas had declared their independence from Mexico in 1836. Many people wanted Texas to be part of the United States, but other people avoided this issue because slavery was common in Texas. And so in 1836, Texas becomes an independent nation, although there is a continual push for Texas to become part of the United States, which it finally does in 1845. But the problem is that Mexico is not willing to let Texas take a huge chunk of their land. So taking a look at this map, the area in the light yellow color is the area that is sort of Texas, although the area in the green is the area that is claimed to be Texas by the Texans. And the problem is that this leads to a war with Mexico. So the Mexican-American War breaks out because of the annexation of Texas. Once that war is over, the United States is going to gain this huge chunk of land that we call the Mexican Cession. So take a look at the map here. We're talking about California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and even a little bit of Wyoming. But the issue of slavery is infused in this debate. I mean, even as soon as the war breaks out, there was an effort by this guy, Congressman David Wilmot, to completely ban slavery in any territory that we were to acquire from Mexico. Now, keep in mind that the war has just broken out, and Wilmot is saying, if we happen to gain any land from Mexico, we're not going to allow slavery there. When this Wilmot proviso is proposed in Congress, it's rejected, not along party lines. So this is not a debate between the Whigs and the Democrats, but rather a debate between Northerners and Southerners. When the United States wins the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is what gives this huge chunk of land to the United States. And during this time, there is an effort to allow the people who actually settle here to decide whether or not to allow slavery. So the idea of popular sovereignty, letting the people decide, ends up being the conclusion in the Mexican Cession. Just a really quick side note here with the presidential election of 1848, we have this struggle within the Whig Party, and it's going to foreshadow its collapse. We have what were called the Northern Conscience Whigs and the Southern Cotton Whigs. And so it's important to understand this sort of conflict within the Whig Party because of the sectional crisis. By the time we get to 1850, we have a whole series of debates surrounding the issues of territories and slavery and boundaries. And so rather than discuss all of those in detail, I want to just talk about how those issues were at least temporarily settled. So the Compromise of 1850, once again, Henry Clay comes to the rescue with this proposal, and it does 5 very important things. First of all, because of the California gold rush, California very quickly gained enough settlers to become a state. So in 1850, California enters the Union as a free state. The second thing the compromise does is it formally establishes Utah and New Mexico territory and then allows the people living there to decide whether or not to allow slavery. The third issue is formalizing the border between Texas and New Mexico. Texas, and you can kind of see it on the outline of this map, had claimed territory all the way up into what is today Wyoming. But the U.S. government is going to pay Texas $10 million to give up that portion of New Mexico territory. And that gives Texas its iconic shape. Fourth, there's going to be a new fugitive slave law that's going to require Northerners assist in the return of runaway slaves. This is going to lead to a huge conflict later on. And then fifth and final provision is it's going to outlaw the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Slavery would still be allowed. You just could not buy or sell slaves within the District of Columbia. So coming back to our questions to think about, what were the precedents set by the Northwest Ordinance? First, it has to do with the fact that any new territory incorporated into the United States would be equal status with the existing states. There wouldn't be any sort of second-class citizens or second-class territories. It also sets up the path for statehood. Once you get 5,000 settlers, you set up a territorial government. Once you get 60,000 settlers, you apply for statehood. And then finally, the Northwest Ordinance is going to completely ban slavery in this area. And it's going to set up a precedent of debate between the pro-slavery forces that want to expand into the Western territories and the abolitionists who want to prevent that. Second, how was the issue of slavery solved in the Louisiana Purchase? That is solved by the Missouri Compromise, drawing a line. Third, how does the issue of slavery solved in Oregon and Texas? Oregon just completely bans slavery from the time of its territorial existence. And then Texas, part of the reason Texas breaks away from Mexico is because the Anglo settlers there wanted slavery. And then our final question, how did the Compromise of 1850 settle the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession? And the answer is popular sovereignty. They're going to allow the people who live there to decide whether or not slavery would be allowed. Stay tuned for part 2 of sectionalism.